In the previous episode of Faking Michael, we heard from Robert Whitman, the founder of the FBI's art crime team.
Anyone who comes to me that talks about any type of forgeries, the first thing we have to do is the same in every case. Look at the actual allegation itself and determine whether or not the pieces that we're looking at are forgeries to begin with.
When I spoke to Whitman, he told me that to investigate cases in which art forgery is being alleged, the FBI collects evidence in three key areas: provenance, connoisseurship, and forensics. And so when analysing the evidence in this podcast series, I decided to dedicate an episode to each of those three key areas. We started this process in episode 9 by taking a detailed look at the provenance of the Cascio tracks. And in doing so, we were unable to find any evidence that Michael Jackson had ever recorded the vocals.
All we know for sure is that at the time of Michael's death in 2009, the songs had James Port's voice on them. But somehow, by the time they were sold to the estate in 2010, they had someone else's voice on them, a so-called Michael Jackson vocal.
And so one of the things we're going to look at in this episode are those so-called Michael Jackson vocals from the perspective of several Jackson experts, also known as connoisseurs.
Connoisseurship basically is opinion. It's the opinion of individuals who are expert in that specific genre, oeuvre, or field. So an artist who is well-known might have experts that have studied his work for years. You know, you'd have people who are expert in a specific band and a specific singer who have trained their ears over the years to identify that singer's nuances, like the music he sings. They recognize the topics that he gets involved with. And those connoisseurs would be people who could be brought into an investigation to make an opinion, to opine on the authenticity of something.
We've already heard from a number of connoisseurs throughout this series when detailing the reaction of Michael's family, fans, and former collaborators to hearing the Cascio tracks for the first time. In this episode, we'll recap the most important issues that were raised by those connoisseurs, while diving further down the rabbit hole of expert opinion, not only on the authenticity of the vocals, but also on the motives and credibility of the key characters, their official narrative, and those who helped them to spin it. We'll kick things off by recounting the biggest red flags that have been raised regarding the Cascio tracks.
The biggest tell for me was the over-accentuated vibrato.
That's the voice of recording artist Darren Hayes, recalling the moment he heard the Cascio track Breaking News for the first time.
My first reaction was instantaneous. I instantly knew it wasn't Michael Jackson. It was a heart-wrenching feeling.
Best known as the lead singer of the 90s pop duo Savage Garden, Darren is an accomplished recording artist, having sold tens of millions of records around the world over the course of his 3-decade career.
I am a singer who grew up admiring and adoring other vocalists, and the most prominent one, the most influential artist in my whole career is and was Michael Jackson. So when I was a 11 or 12-year-old boy, I learned to use my falsetto, I learned what vibrato was, and I learned about tone from listening and trying to imitate Michael Jackson. So that's the context from which I was coming from when I first heard Breaking News, and I knew it wasn't Michael Jackson from the first, honestly, 5 seconds.
As someone who has studied Michael Jackson's voice in detail, both as a fan and as a professional singer, Darren immediately identified that the vibrato on Breaking News wasn't Michael's vibrato.
Vibrato in a singer's voice, it's almost like a fingerprint. Everyone has a unique vibrato. You can learn to say, lessen your vibrato. You can learn to sustain notes longer before the vibrato kicks in. But essentially, the way that a singer uses their voice, only some of it comes from technique, and a lot of it is just genetics, DNA, and whatever is going on in those tiny folds of skin that are the vocal cords. Michael's vibrato is so unique. I've never heard anybody in the recorded history of music who's ever sounded like him. So that was the biggest tell.
As we've heard in previous episodes, Darren Hayes wasn't the only connoisseur of Michael's voice to identify the vibrato on the Cascio tracks as a red flag, with many of Michael's family, former collaborators, and even fans identifying the exact same issue.
One thing that helped me as a fan was key things in his voice that Michael never did, like extreme rapid vibrato and little inflections here and there as well, but definitely the vibrato.
That's the voice of my co-researcher, Jamin Bull, a lifelong Michael Jackson fan and the founder of a podcast called The MJ Cast. We first heard from Jamin in episodes 1 and 2, when detailing how he initially dismissed the notion that some of the songs being included on the Michael album might be fake.
When you told me about this fake song stuff, I was like, I love my friend Damien, and he's so truthful and knowledgeable, but I don't think I can believe what he's telling me here.
But after repeatedly listening to the Cascio tracks and comparing them with songs that Michael released during his life, Jamin began to notice all of the same issues that I and other fans were picking up on.
I'd heard the respected opinions of other fans, and as soon as I picked up on the vibrato and how that sounded different to Michael's, it was all over. And as soon as I learnt the truth, there was never really a time that I didn't want to join with you and fight for the truth, for Michael's legacy. I was upset, and I felt like it became our duty and our responsibility to defend Michael because he wasn't there to do it himself.
As we heard in episodes 3 and 4, when Michael's family and former collaborators listened to the Cascio tracks, they too identified the vibrato as a major red flag regarding the authenticity of the vocals. Those same connoisseurs also identified that snippets of Michael's real voice had been stolen from his previously released songs and spliced into the Cascio tracks.
The version I heard had a lot of samples in it from other songs.
That's an ad-lib from Earth Song.
Sampled breaths after sampled breaths. Mixed in with fake vocals to try to fool you.
You keep on breaking.
You add an ad-lib here that is him. So now you're thinking the whole thing is him, but it's not.
A number of connoisseurs also raised issues with the lyrics of the Cascio tracks.
I was starting to recognize as well problems with lyrics, like the lyrics of Breaking News, Keep Your Head Up Monster, and all of the Cascio tracks. Lyrically, they're not anywhere near the same level that Michael recorded. They're awkward. There's really awkward moments in them. So that was a problem for me as well.
Recording artist Darren Hayes felt the same way when he first heard Breaking News.
The next tell for me were the lyrics.
Everybody wanting a piece of Michael Jackson.
I don't know if Michael Jackson would have ever referred to himself in the first person or the third person or any person, because he was the king of pop and he didn't need to remind us of who he is.
As we heard in episode 3, several members of the Jackson family also took issue with the lyrics of Breaking News.
The Michael Jackson line, that almost gave me a heart attack.
That's Michael's nephew, Taj Jackson.
Because besides it, you know, in your gut knowing that it's not your uncle, but then knowing that your uncle would never mention himself in a song, it's just not who he is. It's the opposite of him. That was like the dagger in the back. It was just like, that's what they're going to go with. They're going to go with the song that definitely isn't Michael, but also doesn't even represent what he would be singing about.
Michael's brother, Jermaine Jackson, was also skeptical about the lyrics, asking the pop star's longtime recording engineer, Michael Prince, for his opinion.
He said, would Michael sing about himself? And I go, what are you talking about? He says, would Michael sing the words like Michael Jackson in a song? I go, I don't think so.
It should be noted that Breaking News isn't the only song written by James Port and Eddie Cascio in which Michael is referenced by name. In fact, there are 2 others, both of which are among the James Port demos I heard at the US Copyright Office. One of those demos is called Need Your Love, in which Port refers to himself as Michael. The other is Port's demo for Monster, which was later sold to Michael's estate with revised lyrics and a new vocalist. In the version of Monster sold to the estate, you can hear the vocalist sing the lyric, "Mama say, Mama got you in a zigzag."
Yes, mama say, mama got you in a zigzag.
But in the version that I heard at the US Copyright Office, James Port sings the lyric, "Mama say, Mama Michael like a zigzag." Between the vocals on the Cascio tracks and the lyrics that the Cascio vocalist was singing, it quickly became clear to most connoisseurs of Michael's recordings that something was wrong with the songs, with some of those connoisseurs expressing their opinion as part of the public discourse online.
It doesn't sound like him to me.
While others raised their concerns directly with the powers that be at Michael's estate and Sony.
As an audio engineer, I said there are too many audio dead ends for them to be telling the truth.
And then it was just nail after nail after nail in the coffin.
And it was beyond obvious that it wasn't Michael. And I was heartbroken. And it was instantaneous. And I went online. And thousands of fans around the world felt the same way that I did.
The new Michael Jackson track called Breaking News. It's not Michael Jackson.
That's not Michael's voice.
I don't think it's him.
That ain't no Michael Jackson. This song is fake. All the fans, everybody's saying that they don't believe it's Michael.
And it's like, holy crap, this is a masterminded fraud.
And I felt a responsibility to immediately say, you know what? I've studied this man's voice my entire life. This is not Michael Jackson.
As we heard in episode 2, and again in more detail in episode 5, the powers that be at the Michael Jackson estate responded to the backlash from Michael's fans by issuing a lengthy statement.
There is nothing more important to the estate than Michael's music, his legacy, and his fans.
Written by estate attorney Howard Weitzman, the statement claimed that several connoisseurs of Michael's recordings had listened to the Cascio tracks and that they all confirmed the vocals were definitely Michael's. But as we heard in previous episodes, a number of the connoisseurs named in Weitzman's statement, plus several others who were not named, including Michael's family, told both me and members of my research team that they did not authenticate the vocals as Michael's.
We listened to the songs, and it was such an easy thing to prove that it's not him.
I definitely know those aren't my uncle's vocals.
And then you go and get all the engineers that work for him, and they all said, we can't say it is.
To me, it really didn't sound like Michael.
There's no guarantee.
None of us ever said, this is definitely Michael.
But despite the Jackson family insisting that the Cascio tracks were fake, and despite Michael's former collaborators being unwilling to authenticate the vocals, the estate and Sony decided to move forward with the Cascio tracks, a move which further enraged Michael's fans. Recording artist, fan, and connoisseur of Michael's voice, Darren Hayes, gives his thoughts.
The other thing that upsets me about the whole thing is just the blatant disrespect and disregard of fans in general. If a fan has the ability to identify themselves with Michael Jackson, it's because they're tuning into a frequency. And if you then change the frequency but put Michael Jackson's name on there and say it's still Michael Jackson, then you are ignorant to what it is that this man did. And releasing this music without considering how passionate and how informed Michael Jackson's fans were, I felt like it was a very telling act, because we are the caretakers of Michael Jackson's legacy. I feel very strongly about that, about Michael, about defending his intellectual property, his reputation, his legacy. Because who else is going to do this and defend him other than fans and people that love him, love his work, and authentically live and breathe and understand his work in the way that an archivist would in a museum? And it proves that the people in charge of this really didn't understand what it is they were trying to market or sell.
When it comes to expert opinion, a connoisseur of an artist's work may also be able to offer an opinion about the authenticity based on the circumstances surrounding the creation of the work in question. As we know, Eddie Cascio and James Port claim that Michael Jackson recorded their 12 songs within a 2-month period in the fall of 2007, less than 2 years before his death.
He came ready to work, and that's what we did. We spent long hours working in the studio, recording.
And so one piece of circumstantial evidence that must be considered when assessing this claim is Jackson's recording patterns during that period of time.
We hardly recorded any vocals at all, you know? That's not something Michael did the last few years he was alive.
Once again, that's Jackson's longtime recording engineer, Michael Prince. The perspective of Michael Prince is especially valuable in this story because Prince was one of the only recording engineers who worked regularly with Jackson throughout the final decade of his life, including before and after the fall of 2007, making Prince one of the most qualified connoisseurs of Jackson's recording patterns during this key period of time.
It was very uncommon for him to record vocals. Because he realized even a demo with his voice on it, if it got in the wrong hands, could end up on the internet. And he knew that once his vocal was on there, if somebody put it out, he had completely lost control of that song.
As we heard in previous episodes, some of Jackson's unreleased material has indeed leaked online over the years, including several demos and album outtakes from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. As well as songs like Hold My Hand, the duet Jackson recorded with R&B star Akon.
And I think that made him not wanting to put his voice on a song until it was for a record and they were getting ready to really go for it. And as long as it was an instrumental, it was worthless.
Prince recalls that other engineers who worked with Jackson during his final years, including the time he spent in Bahrain and Ireland between mid-2005 and late 2006, also say that in their experience, Jackson had barely recorded any new vocals.
You know, I talked to an engineer friend of mine, and he had flown over to Ireland several times, and he goes, "We never recorded any vocals." And that didn't surprise me, you know. And in all the conversations I've had with John Barnes spent more than a year in Bahrain working with Michael. But he sort of intimated that Michael didn't sing over there at all.
Another person who was recruited to work with Jackson during this time was his former producer, Bill Bottrell, who wrote a handful of new songs for Jackson's consideration, but which the pop star did not record.
It was exciting, and I couldn't stop writing. The idea kept coming and picturing if I could get Michael hooked on some of these things, you know, if I could get his interest, there's no doubt they would have been awesome. And I never got the chance.
And so when Eddie Cascio and James Port came forward with 12 unreleased songs with fully completed vocals, which they claim were recorded by Michael in the fall of 2007, it simply didn't fit with the pop star's recording habits during that period of time. It should be noted that a lot of the audio featured in Faking Michael was originally recorded by the team at the MJ Cast, including audio of Michael Prince, most of which comes from a 2016 interview he did with my co-researchers Jamin Bull and James Allais, together with investigative journalist Charles Thompson.
Today we're going to learn all about what it was like to creatively collaborate with the King of Pop.
From the History World Tour to the Invincible album, and right up until This Is It and the final studio songs MJ was working on, Michael Prince was involved.
Michael Prince, welcome to the MJ Cast.
Oh, thanks very much, guys. Thanks for having me.
When recording their interview, Jamin explained to Prince that he planned to withhold their conversation about the Cascio tracks from the MJcast episode so that it could be heard for the first time here as part of Faking Michael.
This is something that we, as a group of people, going right back to 2010 when that Michael album came out, this is something that we, alongside Damien, have researched every single day. And we deeply respect what Damien is accomplishing with his research and his eventual project that will come out around this. And we'd hate to, put it in here when we feel like there's a time and a place for that information to come out that's really right, that's going to really make a difference.
I would rather wait till, that would be so wonderful.
During their conversation, Jamin told Prince that he'd actually spoken to Eddie Cascio as part of our investigation in an attempt to allow Eddie to tell his side of the story regarding the Cascio tracks.
And I've even had an hour-long FaceTime chat with Eddie Cascio around these songs myself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And what was your conversation like with Eddie?
It was bizarre. Like, the whole thing was he was going to come on our show just like you are today. And I wanted him on the show because I wanted to give him a chance to tell his side of the story and also to question him about the inconsistencies. And we had an hour-long meeting where I spoke to him on FaceTime, and the entire time he just stood behind his story and had excuses for every little thing I raised. Like, I asked him about why there were ad-lib vocals spliced in from other Michael Jackson songs.
Oh, boy.
I directly asked him about that. I said, you can look at the sonics, you can look at the waveform, and there's an ad-lib right in Breaking News, and how come that's there? And his answer to that was, Michael traveled around everywhere with a hard drive of ad-libs that he would just drop into all of his songs wherever he wanted to and reuse them.
Bullshit. That is complete bullshit.
Yeah. And when I spoke to Eddie, I had a real sense of sadness because I also felt really sorry for him. He had clearly been working on these songs with James Port for many, many years with plans for Michael to record them in London. And when that fell apart and that couldn't happen, it must have broken his heart to the point where he wanted to fake it to make his dream a reality.
I think you're right. And I've thought about that too, that, listen, we know Michael loved that family. We know Michael definitely stayed there. And so there's no question that Michael and he were good friends and stuff like that. And I think you're right. I think when MJ passed away, they're sitting there going, gosh, we've got X amount of songs. What the heck do we do now?
Prince could empathise with how Eddie Cascio and James Port might have been feeling in the aftermath of Michael's death, because Prince had also written songs for Michael's consideration, which the pop star had never recorded. In fact, one of those songs, called Shut Up and Dance, which Prince co-wrote with fellow engineer Eric Kirkland, was listed in several of the handwritten notes that were discovered after Michael's death about the new music he was working on during the final years of his life.
And that, I think, was, in his mind, the list of his most important songs.
As we heard in episode 9, across all of the handwritten notes that we've gained access to as part of this investigation, there are 45 song titles which Michael had either already recorded or planned to record for his next album.
And the interesting thing is, none of those songs were from the Cascio collection.
Michael's nephew, Tarrell Jackson, also found himself in a similar situation to Prince, with a song Tarrell had written called I Love You also appearing in Michael's notes in the aftermath of his death. Tarrell explains.
My goal in my life was to always write a song for my uncle. To me, that was the ultimate. That was like, I made it, because my uncle's not going to just work with anyone. So my goal was to write a song that he would record. And when my uncle passed, there were notes of an album he was working on, and I Love You was written as one of the songs with my name on it. And that, to me, was like, it just made me feel really good to know that I was on his radar.
Tarrell wrote the song I Love You around the year 2000 for the group 3T, which Tarrell is part of with his brothers. At the time, their uncle Michael was co-producing some of 3T's music, and when Michael heard Tarrell's demo for I Love You, the pop star took a liking to the track. Terrell's brother and 3T bandmate, Taj Jackson, recalls.
I have a lot of memories of that song. My uncle constantly tried to steal that song from 3T. He loved that song. He made it known. He's like, Terrell wrote an incredible song, and my uncle made it known that he loved the song. It was one of those songs he wanted to record. It's a beautiful song, and it would have been great for Michael to have sung on it, but it just never happened.
Another example of songs being written for but never recorded by Jackson during the final years of his life is the material that R&B star Ne-Yo was writing for Jackson between the years 2007 and 2009. As we heard in episode 8, Ne-Yo recalls that he wrote several tracks that were intended for Jackson to record after the launch of his This Is It concert series in London.
The plan was to get in and record these records after that tour. Right. We were supposed to get in and record these records. And of course, you know, he passed before he even got a chance to do that tour. Wow. So, yeah. So it's all me on the vocals. And nothing feels right, if that makes sense. Like, it don't feel right to drop them as my own because I wrote them for Mike.
When Ne-Yo was asked whether he would consider having other artists sing on the songs that he'd written for Jackson, the R&B star was strong in his response.
These records were written for Michael Jackson. I'm not putting another voice on his records. I'm not doing it. I personally can't do it. I can't do it.
But as we heard in episode 9, when discussing the provenance of the Cascio tracks, an engineer who worked on the tracks, named Angelo Montrone, told me and my research partner that James Port and Eddie Cascio were open to putting other voices on the tracks they had written for Michael.
So in the months after Michael had died, James Port had told Montrone that they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with these songs, that they're going to maybe get someone else to sing on them.
And despite the fact that Michael had barely finished any new material during his final years, despite the fact that the vocals on the Cascio tracks were not consistent with Michael's vocals, and despite the lack of evidence that Michael had ever actually recorded them, James Port and Eddie Cascio sold their 12 tracks to Sony and the estate as authentic Michael Jackson recordings.
I mean, the Cassios, when they first announced they had this album, they came in with a power play. They came in armed to the teeth. They already had their attorney in place. They had spent a year finishing the songs, and they basically came in and swept up some cash and ruined their reputation. And it kind of shows you how desperate the estate and Sony were, because there aren't that many finished tracks.
While Michael Jackson had barely recorded any finished tracks during the final years of his life, we know that during that same period of time, Eddie Cascio and James Port recorded plenty of finished tracks, including the tracks they were writing for Michael.
I do know this, that James do songs that's already completed. So when he give it to people, that's how he wanted to be done. In other words, the chorus, the verses, everything is already done.
That's the voice of James Port's former roommate and friend, Jerome Booker, taken from an interview he did with me and my research partner, Jamin Bull. We first heard from Booker in episode 6, when discussing the backstories of James Port and Eddie Cascio, and how their lives intersected with Michael's. And since this episode is all about connoisseurship, my research team and I decided to look at Cascio and Port as songwriters and producers, based on the opinions of those who knew or worked with them. As we heard in episode 6, and in more detail in episode 9, Port was a prolific songwriter who wrote and recorded an abundance of songs over the years, both for his own projects and for other artists. And as Jerome Booker explained a moment ago, Port's creative process involved completing those songs before presenting them to the artists they were intended for.
So, in other words, what I'm trying to tell you is, when he presents his stuff to other people, it's already completed. So they can have a picture of basically how this thing is done. So he's gonna have the song completed, mixed and mastered, or mixed to a point where it's good enough, and then he's gonna have everything written out. The verses, the chorus, he's always done that. And James don't switch up his method. His method is his method. And that's always been his method when he's presenting songs to people. They're complete. So in essence, what I'm saying is he wants you to hear the song how he thinks it's supposed to sound.
Booker's testimony about Port's creative process is consistent with everything that my research team and I have uncovered as part of this investigation, including what we found at the US Copyright Office, where the songs that Port was writing for Michael in the final years of his life were fully complete at the time of his death, which is the opposite of most of the songs that Michael himself was writing during that same period of time, most of which were instrumental tracks without vocals, or rough demos with scratch vocals, but without complete lyrics. As we heard in episodes 5 and 8, when questions were raised regarding the Cascio tracks, James Port and Eddie Cascio reportedly claimed that they'd erased all of Michael's vocal outtakes before destroying the hard drives and computer that the vocals were originally recorded on. Recording engineer Michael Prince, who attended several meetings regarding the authenticity of the vocals, recalls.
When push came to shove and we had these meetings, and I asked him to bring the other hard drives, the backups, the other outtakes, the takes, he goes, once Michael had us make the comp, he asked us to destroy all the other vocal takes, so we did.
But Prince says that destroying Michael Jackson's vocal recordings is something that no engineer would ever do.
Nobody would ever do that. Nobody would ever do that, you know? And so the fact that they had one hard drive that had these songs on there and no other hard drive worked anymore and they'd all been destroyed and all the other takes had been erased and even the computer they used at the time stopped working, so it was destroyed. They kept using the word destroyed.
As we heard in episode 5, Prince first met James Port more than a decade before the Cascio fiasco, during the recording of Jackson's final studio album, Invincible, at the Hit Factory recording studio in New York.
I mean, James Port is not stupid. You know, he was an assistant on Invincible at the Hit Factory. So yeah, it was just really weird knowing what I know about James, knowing what his background is. There's no way that there weren't backup copies. I mean, you make 3 copies of everything at the end of every day. That's what you do. After Michael leaves, you sit there just making backup copies because you can't ever lose anything ever with Michael sang on it.
Port's former roommate, Jerome Booker, expressed similar sentiments to Prince, insisting that Port was very thorough and organised when it came to recording vocals, backing up files, and providing a quality studio experience for the artists that he worked with.
He's very thorough with that. You know, let me tell you something. He's very thorough. He's very organized. He's super smart.
Yeah.
And then you got to understand something. James was the Hit Factory manager for 2 buildings. He's very thorough with handling multi-complex problems.
As we've heard throughout this series, another red flag raised by connoisseurs of Michael's recordings regarding the Cascio tracks was that none of Michael's trademark recording habits, like the sound of him snapping his fingers, clapping his hands, or stomping his feet to the rhythm of the track, were present on any of the lead vocals.
You don't ever hear his foot stomping on the ground. You don't ever hear him snap his fingers.
There's no foot stomping. There's no finger snaps.
Where's the snapping of the fingers? You know, things that Michael does characteristic.
It's well documented that Michael Jackson would intentionally record his vocals in environments that would allow these ambient rhythmic sounds to be captured in the vocal track, something that Cascio track co-writer James Port was also fully aware of, and even helped facilitate for Michael at the Hit Factory.
I was at the Hit Factory and there was a makeshift stage, and I asked James, "What is this?" And he said, "We had to build that for Michael the other night because he likes to spin around and dance while he records."
That's the voice of singer-songwriter Amy Gilvary, who worked with James Port at the Hit Factory in the early 2000s, while Michael Jackson was also recording there. We first heard from Amy when discussing Port's backstory in episode 6, and there are several interesting takeaways from Amy's testimony which raise questions regarding the official Cascio Tracks narrative, including her testimony about Michael's makeshift wooden stage.
We would build this 8x8 raised platform for him to stand and sing on.
That's the voice of engineer Stuart Brawley, who also worked with Michael at the Hit Factory in the early 2000s, when James Port was managing the studio.
Michael also liked to dance when he was singing and snap his fingers and stomp his feet, and he wanted the reflections created by this platform we built to come back to the microphone when we were recording his vocals. And literally, if you just soloed the microphone that he had recorded into, you didn't even need the music behind him. He was literally a one-man band, and there's nobody else like him.
The irony of Brawley's testimony, as we heard in episodes 5 and 8, is that in the aftermath of Michael's death, James Port and Eddie Cascio actually hired Brawley to co-produce and mix the 12 Cascio tracks before they were sold to Michael's estate as authentic Jackson recordings. It's worth noting at this point that Eddie Cascio himself has also said that he had a wooden dance floor installed in his studio in the fall of 2007, which is when and where Eddie claims that Michael recorded the Cascio tracks.
Well, the vocals were done actually right in this room. Right here, we had a regular wooden dance floor put in just for him.
But somehow, even though Cascio had a wooden dance floor in his studio, no trace of the ambient sounds that Michael would generate while dancing during a recording session were found in the vocal recordings that Cascio and Port asked engineer Stuart Brawley to mix. And so when producing those mixes, based on the way he knew Michael recorded, Brawley must have noticed that the vocals on the Cascio tracks were missing those trademark Jackson sounds. We'll come back to Brawley's involvement with the Cascio tracks shortly, but for now, let's get back to the takeaways from Amy Gilvari's testimony. As we heard in episode 6, while working with James Port at the Hit Factory recording studio, Amy not only discovered Michael's dance platform, but also his handwritten notes about the songs Michael was working on at the time.
On the wall, like just kind of tacked to the wall, there was a piece of paper. Then he said, that's Michael's notes, like how he feels for the songs.
This takeaway about seeing Michael's handwritten notes is also interesting because it fits right in with Michael's modus operandi from the 1970s all the way up to his death in 2009. And while Michael was known to have written abundance of notes throughout his career, my research team and I have failed to find a single note in Michael's handwriting about any of the 12 tracks, which Cascio and Port posthumously attributed to Michael. One final takeaway from my interview with Amy Gilvari is her testimony about Port's home recording studio, where Amy also worked with Port in the early 2000s. As we've heard in previous episodes, one of the excuses given for the way the Cascio tracks sound is that they were recorded in a home studio located in the Cascio family's basement, without the world-class technology and equipment that would usually be used to record Michael's vocals. But when I spoke to Amy, she told me that Port had always used professional equipment, even when recording in his home studio.
James, had a little studio in his apartment uptown. So it was a little room, but everything was professional. The equipment seemed really good. And he was a producer. He was kind of like a mentor in terms of the recording, just kind of explaining to me how to be a better singer and how to be a better recording artist and what that entailed. In the sense that this is how you make a great recording. I had never really made great recordings. I had sung before in my life, but being a recording artist is a very specific thing. And I'm sure he wanted to make the best product from my voice also because it was showcasing him as an engineer and producer.
In fact, Amy told me that Port used the same microphones for her recordings in the early 2000s as Michael's engineers used for his recordings. Amy also told me that Port used an industry-standard digital audio workstation called Pro Tools to record her vocals and produce her demos, the same exact workstation used by Michael's engineers. And And since Port already had the same technology and equipment that Michael's engineers used in the early 2000s, you'd assume that if Michael really did record the Cascio tracks in the fall of 2007, Port would have used that same technology and equipment during those sessions. And if Michael really did record the Cascio tracks in the fall of 2007 using that same technology and equipment, you'd assume that his vocals would have sounded like Michael Jackson. But to countless connoisseurs of Michael's voice, they didn't. As we've heard throughout this series, when Eddie Cascio and James Port were asked to explain the issues with the vocals on their tracks, the pair attended a meeting at the office of John Branca, one of the co-executors of Michael Jackson's estate. Two additional people who were also at that meeting were engineer Michael Prince, who was there to offer his opinion as a connoisseur of Jackson's recordings, and fellow engineer Stuart Brawley, who Eddie Cascio and James Port had hired to work on their tracks before they sold them to the estate. It's worth remembering, as we heard in episode 8, that Stuart Brawley is known in the music industry as an engineer who can get a really good vocal sound when mixing a track.
If I'm known for anything in terms of production or style, it's a really good vocal sound and vocal arrangements. And so that's always the focus point when I'm building a mix. I usually start with the vocal first. I want to get it sounding the way it needs to sound.
And as we heard in previous episodes, fellow engineer Michael Prince recalls that during their meeting at John Branca's office, someone asked Brawley what his role was when working on the Cascio tracks, and that Brawley's response raised more questions than answers.
Somebody asked him, Stuart, what was your involvement in all this? He goes, well, they sent me the songs. My job was to make it sound like Michael. And he said that right in the meeting. And I'm going like, well, what does that mean?
As we heard earlier in this episode, when my research partner Jamin Bull spoke with Eddie Cascio as part of this investigation, Jamin actually asked Eddie about Stuart Brawley in an attempt to get more information about Brawley's involvement with the Cascio tracks.
And so I wanted to ask Eddie about this character, and I asked him to what extent was Stuart involved in the project, and I remember Eddie saying something like, to finish the project you really need to bring in the right people, and that's why they brought in Stuart Brawley.
Yeah, Stuart was there. He helped see the project through. Whenever you're working on a project like that, you've got to bring in the right team.
There wasn't a lot of detail at all beyond that from Eddie. So eventually I wanted to speak to Stuart myself, and what I was trying to achieve with this interaction was to elicit a response where Stuart would be on record as an expert around the audio inconsistencies in the tracks. So I asked him about the vibrato, the copy and pasted ad-libs, the lack of Michael Jackson characteristics like finger snaps and foot stomps, and asked him if he had any concerns about the authenticity of the vocals in general, and I reached out to him via Twitter.
As we mentioned in episode 5, Brawley actually replied to Jamin, telling him that he trusted Eddie Cascio and James Port and had no concerns over the authenticity of the vocals. Brawley also said that he would address all of the audio inconsistencies that Jamin had raised by publishing an extensive article via his website. But unfortunately for those of us seeking answers, Brawley never published the article and hasn't replied to Jamin, me, or any member of our research team since.
So the thing with Stuart Brawley is I've spoken to dozens and dozens of collaborators over the years. I never have hesitancy from genuine Michael collaborators to go on the record and talk about their stories. Stuart Brawley was a roadblock from the start. I even reached out to him through other avenues beyond that point, and nothing, zero. Stuart completely disappeared.
It's worth remembering that Stuart Brawley only worked on the Cascio tracks after Michael's death and wasn't involved with the writing or production of James Port's original demos during Michael's life. But as part of our investigation, my research team and I wanted to speak with people who had worked with Eddie Cascio and James Port while Michael was alive. Jamin explains.
So I very much wanted to research who could have interacted with Eddie and or James, because I kind of figured that if they were genuinely working on Michael's songs before he passed away, there might be other people that were involved who'd be able to speak to what was really going on. So I remember spending a lot of time trawling through the liner notes in the Michael album booklet, finding out collaborators, engineers, producers, all kinds of technical people from the studio, and just reaching out to talk to people who were involved pre-2009.
Two people we were able to speak to were mixing engineers Glenn Marchese, who is credited for work he did on the songs Breaking News and Monster in 2008, and Angelo Montrone, who worked on Keep Your Head Up and 3 other Cascio tracks in 2009. As we heard in episode 9, Marchese told me that when he worked on the tracks in 2008, Michael had not yet recorded them. Were you present for the recording of Michael's vocals?
I was not present in the recordings.
Did he sing them before or after you did the mixing on them? After, okay. Do you have any information to substantiate that he did sing them?
I have no proof. I'm not trying to prove it. That's where I'll leave it.
And as we also heard in episode 9, Angelo Montrone told me and my research partner that when he worked on the Cascio tracks in 2009, in the weeks before Michael's death, they still didn't have Michael's vocals.
According to Montrone, he was told by James Port that Michael Jackson was going to record the vocals. It was always a future tense thing that Michael Jackson was going to be doing. And as of June 17th, 2009, you don't hear a single Michael Jackson vocal. No Michael Jackson vocals anywhere.
Over the course of our investigation, my research team and I have collectively reached out to every single person that we've identified as having worked with James Port and Eddie Cascio. But aside from Glenn Marchese and Angelo Montrone, getting those people on the record has proven to be a difficult task. My research partner Jamin explains.
Anyone I was reaching out to, I was being met with roadblocks or problems where they couldn't talk. I was either met with no response, a hard no around speaking on it, or some kind of vague response that might mention like an NDA and not being able to talk on it. And that's at complete odds with my attempts to talk with non-Cascio track Michael Jackson collaborators. It's night and day. And I started to realize that there was a real kind of stink around this whole thing. And it really felt like there was a cone of silence lowering over these individuals.
The most significant person in this story who's been under a cone of silence is James Port himself. To this day, James Port has never spoken publicly about the work he purportedly did with Michael Jackson, or the work we know he did with Eddie Cascio. In fact, when Eddie appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show in December of 2010 to defend the authenticity of their tracks, not only did James Port not accompany him, but his name wasn't even mentioned during the broadcast.
Michael and Eddie recorded 12 songs. Eddie produced and wrote with Michael Jackson. Produced and written by Michael Jackson and Eddie Cascio. Written and produced by Eddie Cascio and Michael Jackson.
And so, when my research partner Jamin Bull spoke with Eddie as part of this investigation, he tried to extract more information about Eddie's work with Port. Jamin explains.
James Port really is still, even to this day, one of the most mysterious people connected to the songs because he's never spoken about it. So I wanted to ask Eddie about his friend and collaborator on the songs, James Port. So I asked him, and what was interesting is the lack of detail that Eddie was able to give me around the recording sessions with James. So these guys had worked together for like a decade, and it just seemed that there was sort of a disconnect where Eddie wasn't really able to go into the level of detail that I would expect.
But it wasn't just the lack of detail about Eddie's work with Port that took Jamin by surprise. It was also the lack of detail about their supposed work with Michael.
Over the years, I've had the privilege of being able to interview dozens and dozens of people that worked with Michael in the studio, capturing their stories for the MJ Cast. And always these professionals, whether it be engineers or producers or musicians, are free and open with their stories, wanting to detail how amazing it was being able to work with the King of Pop. There's no limit to the details they give. But with Eddie, it was very, very different. It felt like there wasn't a lot of detail or information to gain, which really, really surprised me. I also asked him how often he goes back to listen to the work that he made with James and allegedly Michael. And his response was odd. It was something to the effect of that he very rarely or never goes back and listens to it.
Do you ever go back and listen to those songs you did with Mike, or?
Not really. Not really. Not really.
Which certainly took me by surprise because, man, if I made some songs with the King of Pop, they'd be on repeat.
While Jamin was able to speak with Eddie Cascio for more than an hour, my other co-researcher, James Allais, didn't have the same success when he reached out to Eddie for an interview about his supposed work with Michael Jackson.
There are some people that have been very easy to speak to throughout this whole journey, and there are some people who just have been absolutely impossible to speak to. And for me, one of them has been Eddie Cascio. You know, my interaction with him has been very bizarre.
Over the years, James and I have made several attempts to reach Eddie as part of this investigation, including a number of unanswered phone calls, emails which have not been returned, and even a visit to the Cascio family's Italian restaurant in New Jersey, where we met several members of Eddie's family, but not Eddie himself. But there was one particular phone call which didn't go unanswered. James explains.
I called him up, and he seemed to believe I was somebody else.
Hello?
Yes, hello, Eddie. Is this Eddie?
No, it's not. Who's this?
My name is James. I'm looking for Mr. Cascio, Eddie Cascio.
No, you don't have the right number. This is asshole.
This is asshole.
Yeah, monkey.
He was calling me monkey, saying this is asshole. He clearly thought I was some other friend.
The friend that Eddie mistook James for is a man called Omar Batty, whose nickname is Monkey, something that James didn't know at the time of the call.
Yeah. Yeah, monkey. What do you think? I don't know your voice?
You might. I've been hoping to talk to you. Hopefully you're willing.
You don't think I know your voice, monkey? What's up?
How's it going?
I'm good.
And when I revealed to him that I'm not some other friend, that I wanted to ask him about his work with Michael Jackson, he continued to believe that I was this friend. I don't think we've spoken before. I don't know if you're mistaken. I'm working on a project, Michael Jackson project, and I just was hoping to interview you with a couple questions. And he was telling me to call him back on the bat phone, on his private line, I guess.
Yo, just hit me back on the bat phone, monkey. Go ahead. Hit me back on the bat phone.
And bizarre. That was a bizarre interaction.
As we've heard throughout this series, when questions were first raised regarding the vocals on the Cascio tracks, the estate reached out to people they considered to be connoisseurs of Michael's music, including several engineers and producers who were asked to listen to the tracks and give their opinion. But it wasn't just engineers and producers that the estate reached out to.
So they asked me, do you know anything about these tracks? And I said, no.
That's the voice of Joseph Vogel, author of the book Man in the Music, The Creative Life and Work of Michael Jackson. As we heard in episode 1, prior to the questions being raised regarding the vocals on the Cascio tracks, Vogel had been researching Michael's music for 5 years, and had even mentioned the Cascio tracks in a draft of his book, which the estate had a copy of. And so when trying to get to the bottom of the Cascio fiasco, the estate reached out to Vogel to see if he had any inside information about the tracks.
Which I told them that I didn't have any inside information on it because the people that I talked to didn't know anything about those songs.
As we heard in episode 1, the limited information that Vogel did have about the Cascio tracks came from a reporter named Roger Friedman, who had published a series of exclusive articles about them via his website at showbiz411.com.
So I told them that my source was Roger Friedman. Because he was the one that was writing about him.
Vogel wasn't the only person who used Roger Friedman as a source of information about the Cascio tracks prior to their release. In fact, that's exactly how I, and my co-researcher James, learned of their existence. James recalls.
The first I really knew of the Cassios, first time I ever looked into the Cassios, Eddie Cascio and Frank Cascio and all these characters, was the Roger Friedman article.
Bombshell exclusive. Michael Jackson recorded a whole new album of material in the fall of 2007.
And what a backstory. What a wonderful story from Michael's surrogate family.
Jackson spent 3 months with the Cascio family in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey. During that time, Michael recorded at least a dozen tracks with Eddie Cascio.
And that's exactly how the estate was hearing it. That's exactly how Sony was hearing it. And other collaborators in Michael's world.
According to one source who's heard the material, Michael's vocals are, quote, perfect. The question now, of course, is what happens next.
And while Friedman isn't a connoisseur of Michael's music, he did have the inside scoop regarding the Cascio tracks, and appears to have had a vested interest in convincing the public of their purported authenticity. Since his very first article about the tracks in May of 2010, Friedman has made at least 27 assertions that the vocals belong to Michael, posturing himself as someone who knows better than Michael's family and former collaborators, while ignoring the wealth of compelling evidence that the songs might actually be fake. Over the years, Friedman has taken issue with Michael's most dedicated connoisseurs, his fans, denouncing them as deranged, crazy, idiotic, bitter, and stupid for speaking out against the Cascio tracks, and even blaming them for the underwhelming performance of the Michael album. On several occasions, Friedman has made excuses for the issues with the Cascio tracks, including claiming that the songs were just demos, that they weren't professionally recorded, and that Michael had merely laid down a guide vocal, all claims that we've disproven throughout this series. Friedman also claimed that there was concrete proof that the vocals were authentic, including handwritten notes and work tapes, neither of which have ever been published. It's worth noting that Roger Friedman had established relationships with 3 key people connected to the Cascio tracks. 1. Eddie Caccio's brother, Frank Cascio. 2. Michael Jackson's former manager, Frank DeLeo, who also worked with Frank Cascio and James Port. And 3. Attorney Howard Weitzman, who led the estate's investigation into the authenticity of the Cascio tracks. And like Roger Friedman, all 3 of them insisted that the vocals belonged to Michael. We discussed Friedman's friendship with Frank Cascio in episode 6, including that Cascio attended Friedman's 50th birthday party and had even given Friedman information about the stories he was writing about Michael. In the case of Frank DeLeo and Howard Weitzman, Friedman wrote about his friendships with them in articles following their respective deaths. In one of those articles, Friedman refers to DeLeo as a friend who he had known for many years, while Weitzman is not only referred to as a friend, but also as a resource who was, quote, always there to help when Friedman, quote, needed insights into a case or something in Hollywood. It's also worth noting that I wanted to ask Friedman about these connections and about his reporting on the Cascio tracks in general, so I invited him to record an interview with me for this podcast series. But as we heard in episode 6, Friedman declined my invitation. And so before we move on, my research partner James gives his thoughts on Friedman's coverage of the Cascio tracks, and how the reporter helped to endorse the tracks despite all the red flags that were raised by connoisseurs of Michael's music.
It's clear from his reporting that Friedman has an unwavering loyalty to the Cascio family, which explains why he's been steadfast in his defense of these songs for more than a decade, despite all the evidence against them. Instead of posturing himself as a neutral reporter, Friedman acts as a judge himself, and he has determined that the vocals belong to Michael. And that's how he reports them. And then it was supersized and amplified by the Cascio connection to paint a narrative, an origin story around this secret album. You know, the fact that it came from this loving, sweet home where Michael would live a normal life, eating normal spaghetti. Honestly, his articles almost read as if he was a member of the Angelicson team. You know, if you're a name like the Cassios and you say you've got Michael Jackson tracks, say no more. Say no more. And literally, they've said no more. That's all they said is we're the Cassios and we have a Michael Jackson album. And they've said nothing else. You know, they pieced together a brilliant narrative that for many, many people was all they needed, all the evidence they needed, because they were built up to such high esteem. And it was a perfect story. You know, it was too perfect because the second we heard those fake Jason Malachi vocals, faking, breaking the news, we were so crushed. We were so crushed. We were so crushed.
Throughout this episode so far, we've heard testimony from several connoisseurs of Michael's music regarding the Cascio tracks. And we've also looked at Eddie Cascio and James Port's work as songwriters and producers. To conclude this episode, we're going to hear testimony from connoisseurs of Jason Malachi, the man who many believe is the actual vocalist on the Cascio tracks, including Breaking News.
I heard the Breaking News song all over the internet. So when I clicked on the link and listened to the song, everybody wanting a piece of Michael Jackson. I'm like, damn, that's not Michael, that's Jason.
That's Jason's former producer, Tony Curtis, who we heard from in episodes 7 and 8.
You know, so for somebody to release that song and tell the world that it's Michael Jackson, that's an embarrassment. That's an embarrassment. That's an embarrassment.
After having worked with Jason off and on for 10 years, Tony considers himself to be one of the world's top connoisseurs of Jason's voice, and says that based on his experience, he knows that Jason, not Michael, is singing on the Cascio tracks.
I know without a shadow of a doubt it's Jason. I worked with Jason 10 years. I know everything about his voice, and I would be willing to bet anything on it. I would know his voice from anywhere, because I've worked with him so long, and I helped structure his vocals and his breathing patterns, and so I would know his voice anywhere. I could tell you every detail about Jason's voice.
As we've heard throughout this series, Tony wasn't the only connoisseur of Jason's voice who immediately identified that Jason, not Michael, was singing on the Cascio tracks.
From the first note, you know something's wrong. It was Jason.
That's the voice of investigative journalist AJ Duggar, a fan of both Michael's music and Jason's, who we also heard from in episodes 7 and 8.
My ears told me right away because Jason, I just knew the vibrato was obvious. Just Jason's got that shaky vibrato. It was obvious, and I knew I wasn't crazy listening to it because on all the websites all over the place, everybody was saying the same thing I was saying.
That's not Michael.
I don't think it's him.
It's this other singer, Jason Malachi.
Jason Malachi.
Jason Malachi.
They were like, man, we just been Malachi. That's not Michael Jackson.
As I've disclosed throughout this series, upon hearing Breaking News, I also felt that the singer was Jason, as did my research partner, James Allais, who has tried valiantly to give Jason the chance to answer our questions regarding his alleged involvement with the Cascio tracks. James explains.
The second I heard Breaking News on November 8th, 2010, within seconds, I believed I was hearing Jason Malachi. I knew Jason Malachi. I knew Mamacita. And as the whole tidal wave around Breaking News made its way around the globe, and people like Jason Malachi's former producer, Tony Curtis, comes out and says he believes it's Jason Malachi. Many people on all the forums and on Twitter believe it's Jason Malachi. You know, so I've been trying to reach out to him since 2010. Writing him emails, he won't answer my emails. I'd call his house, and I'd get an answer.
Hello?
From presumably his wife. And the second, you reveal why you're asking for Jason, or who you are, or what you're calling about, they hang up. Just weird to me. It does not seem like the behavior of somebody unevolved. And when I'd call and I'd get Jason, he would tell me I have the wrong number.
There's no one here by that name. You have the wrong number.
And I knew I didn't have the wrong number.
As we heard in episode 8, James isn't the only person who reached out to Jason about the Cascio tracks. In fact, in the aftermath of the premiere of Breaking News, investigative journalist AJ Duggar did the exact same thing.
I approached him several times privately, through emails and Facebook, like, hey, I know you're getting a lot of hate right now. I know it's a lot of heat on you. People are saying things. So I asked him, did you sing on these songs? And he told me the only thing he said was, I can't confirm or deny anything right now. And that's what made me think he was under some type of contract or in some kind of trouble or something, like forced to do it or scared for his life. I didn't know the details. But, for him to say that I can't confirm or deny anything, just admitting it without admitting it.
Jason's former producer, Tony Curtis, recalls that he got the same response that AJ got when he confronted Jason about the vocals on the Cascio tracks.
He drove all the way to my house and told me I can't confirm or deny. But all I can say is that you know me and you know my voice better than most. So if you're thinking it's me, then it's because you know me better than most people. But who even says I can't confirm or deny? If you say I can't confirm or deny if I did that, you did it. I mean, but he knows I know it's him. I told him, I'm like, you don't have to beat around the bush with me, or you don't have to play no games with me. I know it's you. His response was, I know. Exactly 3 I knows, just like that. It was, I know.
Another person who has reached out to Jason on several occasions over the years is my research partner, Jamin Bull.
After 2010, after the release of the Michael album, there was no shortage of fans reaching out to this guy, whether it be through Facebook or Twitter or in so many different kind of ways. People tried to contact this guy. So I always knew it would be very hard to get in contact with Jason in general. So I tried a few different methods in doing that. One of the ways that I reached out to him was by calling him at home. His house number has been publicly available for quite some time, so I've called him at home.
Hello?
Hello, is this Jason Capetta?
How's it going?
Yeah, this is Jamin Bull.
As we heard in episode 7, Jason's real name is not Jason Malachi, it's Jason Capetta, which is how Jamin addressed Jason when calling him on the phone.
There's been other times that I've called him at his place of work. The fan community knew that Jason Capetta was a deputy sheriff at the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, so it wasn't that difficult to ring him at work and ask him. I asked the receptionist to speak to Jason Capetta, or Deputy Capetta I called him, and she put me straight through to him. It was a very odd conversation because I could tell it was definitely him. His voice sounded exactly like what I would have expected it to. The receptionist transferred me right through to him and he picked up, so it was him. But the problem was in the phone call that he said it wasn't him.
Who are you asking for?
I'm looking for a Jason Capetta.
Oh, there's no one there by that name here.
So it was actually a really difficult conversation to have because I was trying to say to him, I want to talk to you. And he's saying, well, I'm not that person, but well, it was him. So that was all kinds of awkward to have that conversation. And it's actually been difficult to establish dialogue with Jason. I would say he's probably one of the most frustrating individuals that I've had to talk to over the years connected to this case. One of the times that I had some degree of success speaking to Jason Malachi was in 2017, when I believe he had gone on Twitter to promote some kind of new project he was doing.
After seeing Jason's post on Twitter promoting his new project, Jamin initiated a dialogue with Jason, pleading with him to be honest about his alleged involvement with the Cascio tracks.
And I remember saying to him, I've called you at home and you tell me I've got the wrong number. I've called you at work and you pretend it's not you. I want to give you the chance to explain why the Cascio tracks singer sounds identical to you, vibrato and all. And Jason replied, "Oh, I'm going to tell everything from my perspective, and my voice will be heard when the time is right, and it will be on a massive media campaign. And you and everyone else can tune in and watch live on national television. You have no idea what I've gone through, but don't you worry, I will set the record straight." And this is the thing with Jason. He says things in riddles. He often says things like, "Oh, there'll be another day where I tell the full truth later," and he never goes into detail about it then and there.
During their conversation, Jamin went on to talk about the vocals on the Cascio tracks, asking Jason why the vibrato and other characteristics on the tracks were identical to the characteristics in his vocals. Jamin also mentioned the abundance of experts, people like the Jackson family, Michael's fans, and even Tony Curtis, who overwhelmingly agreed that Jason was the singer, suggesting to Jason that it was time to be on the right side of history, to be honest and truthful, and to tell us what really happened. But Jamin says that his efforts didn't have the desired effect.
It didn't have the desired effect in terms of him finally being honest, but he did reply with this. He said, "Don't worry, you and everyone else will hear what I have to say when the time is right. Some things aren't always as you think they appear. And for the record, I've always been truthful."
It should be noted that during this conversation, Jason actually told Jamin that he no longer worked at the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office.
I definitely wanted to fact check that, so I called through back there straight after the conversation, and they confirmed that he did still work there, thus making me realize that he continued to not tell the truth.
It should also be noted that Jason still works at the Sheriff's Office, having been elevated to lieutenant in 2023.
And even though Jason was lying to Michael Jackson researchers and fans during this time, as evidenced through his conversation with me, what he didn't do was just straight out say, "I wasn't singing on those songs." Like, he really could have just shut the conversation down very quickly by saying, "I appreciate you looking into this, but I'm sorry, I'm not singing on those songs. You might have to look somewhere else." He's never actually said that. So I think this is the closest that I certainly ever got to talking with him directly about his alleged involvement in the fraud, and it ended up, of course, going nowhere.
Over the years, I too have tried to reach Jason. I've sent emails, text messages, and Instagram DMs inviting him to speak with me for this podcast, the latter of which Jason always reads. On several occasions, Jason has actually replied via Instagram. In most of those replies, he has ignored my invitation, instead sending me links to his latest projects. But in one of those replies, sent in 2018, he acknowledged my request for an interview, telling me, quote, "We'll be able to talk soon," a day which has never come. With Jason repeatedly dodging our questions by message and by phone, my research partner James decided to engage in old-school boots-on-the-ground style journalism by driving across state lines to knock on Jason's door for a face-to-face conversation. James recalls.
It got to the point that I was going to have to make the drive to Maryland and knock on this guy's door. I live in Ohio, so it's like a 7-hour drive from where I live. So obviously that's not ideal. It would be much easier if you would just answer my phone calls. It'd be much easier if you answered my emails, but that wasn't gonna work. Not for him, I guess. So I had to drive out there. I had to drive 7 hours to Maryland to knock on his door. And I had the feeling that it would probably be difficult to get an answer at the door, and then even at that point, probably just get my message across. So I had prepared a letter that I would leave in the event I don't get a chance to have real communication with Jason. I was either going to leave it with whoever answered the door, I would leave it in the mailbox if no one answered the door, which ultimately ended up being the case. I knocked on the door, did not get an answer, and decided to leave the letter in the mailbox. And, in that letter, it's offering him an opportunity. If you are a normal, everyday person and the subject of the biggest music fraud in history, we're the kind of people you'd want to talk to. That we're the ones seeking the truth here, and that if you've got a truth you can share with us, that maybe we'd be the ones you'd want to share it with. And he did not respond to that letter. And he's since done an interview on a podcast, and he talks about these crazy fans who stalk him in connection to this Michael Jackson thing. And I wonder if he means me.
It got really crazy. Like, we were getting like death threats, like legitimate death threats, people calling the house. I literally, like, no joke, we actually had to move. My family, we moved. And even my new location, which we kept super secret and private, people would show up at our door. People would show up and put letters in my mailbox. And it got that severe. Like, some of these fanatics are like, I don't understand. They're like angry and stuff.
And I wonder if he means me, because it's me that's writing him emails, knocking on his door. And I'm quite insulted if he does mean me, because I'm not approaching him like a crazy fan. I'm approaching him saying, hey, bro, everybody online is saying you're connected to one of the biggest frauds in music history. Like, that's pretty wild. What do you think about that? And a normal person who's not connected to this in any formal fashion, who's just caught up in this crazy internet thing, would probably at least answer to somebody, especially the way I approach it, quite professionally. You'd probably at least answer once that it's crazy, that it's wild, that you're not involved. You can't believe you're caught up in this, but he wouldn't even engage me in that way. Like a normal person, neighbor to neighbor, person to person, fan to fan, you know, he wouldn't interact with me in that way. He interacted with me like a person who had signed their life away to some sort of zipped lips agreement, and he refuses to say a thing. And he does not want to be approached with these very simple, basic questions. Like, at the highest level, are you the singer on these songs? He's never once denied it. He's only avoided the questions and then called those questions threats. So, you know, to me, he's been probably the least cooperative person, I think, in all this.
In the next episode of Faking Michael, we'll take the world's first ever deep dive into the forensic evidence regarding the authenticity of the Cascio tracks.
I'm George Papson, P-A-P-C-U-N. Dr. George Papson as an expert witness. I got a PhD in linguistics with a specialization in phonetics.
So everyone has their own sonic fingerprint. And when you look at that more closely, you can start to see, oh, there's the consistencies or inconsistencies that will identify someone's voice. So it's how he used his vibrato, the speed, the amplitude, it's the overtones, the frequencies.
Vibrato is very important in understanding what a singer is doing. That includes the lungs, the vocal folds, and all the aspects of articulation. And so I decided that it would be important to analyze Michael Jackson's vibrato in great detail.
Dr. Papson's methodology was really defensible, and he explained it incredibly well in his report. So Dr. Papson was the right kind of person with the right expertise to make that investigation.
And when you listen back to those tracks, I mean, there's some, to me, very obvious elements involved. The attack of certain things, the glottal shocks, that is unique to each individual, doesn't align with what we know and expect to hear from one of the most noted and identifiable voices in recorded history.
Faking Michael is a production of Oath Media, which is researched, written and narrated by me, Damian Shields. Original score, sound design and mixing by Dan Villalobos. Additional research by James Allais and Jamin Bull, and the teams at the MJ Cast and A Truth Untold. Artwork by Stephen Ward. If you enjoy the Faking Michael podcast, please consider rating, reviewing and sharing it. Faking Michael is an independent piece of investigative reporting. All source material is used in a limited and transformative way for the purposes of commentary, criticism, demonstration and education in accordance with fair use guidelines. Some of that material has been edited for clarity and time. If you'd like to contact the makers of this podcast, support our cause, or order a copy of the Faking Michael book, please visit our website at fakingmichael.com.